Let's start out with just by introducing yourself and kind of background about your history in the area.
Okay, my name is John Reid. I've lived in San Luis Obispo County for 10 years now. Um, I came out here because it was time to get a new job, and it wasn't at the greatest time because it was right around the time of the economic recession, but there were circumstances beyond my control, and I loved San Luis Obispo since I first saw it when I was a senior in high school and considering going to Cal Poly. And I didn't go to Cal Poly, but I always told myself that, one day I'd come back here. I didn't know it would take 30 years, but it did. And since then I've worked as an environmental scientist, civilian state civil service employee at Camp San Luis Obispo, and I've gotten very interested in a group called the Dunites, which was kind of a early counterculture movement, a pre-hippie hippies that lived out in the Oceano Dunes, from like about 1917 to the 1970s, but the biggest era was during the 1930s. And my project is a book about Gavin Arthur, who was the president's grandson and editor of the Dune Forum, which was a magazine that they published from there. And
You said president of the Dunites?
he was actually the grandson of President Chester Alan Arthur, who was a president of the United States.
Gotcha.
And he was raised in luxury and had millionaire parents, but he gave that all up to come out to the dunes and try to form a new community. And my book about him is entitled Gavin Arthur, Counterculture's Renaissance Man.
And what got you interested as a writer to want to take on this project of the Dunites?
Because when I first moved here, I had a lot of free time. I came out here myself, my ex-wife, and our children remained in Eastern California where we moved from because I moved during the school year. So I had free time, and I was living in my RV at the RV park at Camp San Luis Obispo. So I decided to check out the library, and I wanted to start with the history of the area. And there, staring me in the face, was Norm Hammond's book, The Dunites. And I was familiar with them because I had RV'd at the RV park, or at the on the dunes, where the off-road vehicle park is, with some friends years before. And shortly afterward, there was a California Gold episode that featured, the Dunites in the Oceano Dunes. And I remember old Hugh Hauser saying, "You mean there really was a president's grandson that lived out here?" And I was hooked. And suddenly there was this book about their experience, so I rented it from the library, and it was like a whole epiphany. Just the fact that people can live with relatively very little, live minimalistically, and still be very happy. And it was kind of like an unintentional community because people came to the dunes for different reasons and at different times, but they all, were there under the same sky at the same time, and they really developed a community, with the focus on unity. Gavin had a few, hardcore followers that were intent on publishing this magazine, but there were other people in the dunes, and they all kind of gathered together and had a uniform, collective, creative effort.
What do you, so there's this group of people unintentionally came out into the dunes to were they trying to make an alternative community, or?
Gavin and his group were. The others just, came out because they wanted to get away from society, either because of World War One or because of the Depression. Some of them were riding out the Depression. Others came just for the solitude and the ability to be artists and to create in an area where they didn't have to put up with neighbors or, city regulations.
And we're talking the early to mid 1900s.
We're talking about, like the 1920s and 1930s. When
And
you could do that because, you didn't have any park rangers harassing them.
and already back then, there's people feeling the squeeze of consumer culture. Or
Oh,
what
yes. Yeah, definitely. And being victims of it because the Great Depression was a example of, the haves and the have-nots, and the fact that, we had all the resources we wanted and we could produce abundantly, but it was all regulated by cash and flow and the power that people had given money and paper credit, and the fact that the credit was all speculation. There was very little of it that was actually backed in precious metals like gold and silver.
So these people are trying to make a more healthy, conducive community for what they want to do. It sounds like. Right?
Yeah, it was definitely a community where the focus was on the individual, but individuality within community. Everybody worked at a collective effort, the magazine, the Dune Forum, but everyone was free in their own time, and they had a lot of free time to pursue their own creative endeavors or spiritual endeavors.
Did the Dunites stay out in the dunes, on a round-the-clock basis, or did they have interaction with the
They
community?
lived there regularly. They had cabins. If you know the geography of the Oceano Dunes, you've got the four dunes by the beach, and then you've got the high dunes, and in between are a series of little groves of trees, and there's very shallow groundwater underneath them, and they're called coves. So each Dunite had his own cove.
Oh, really?
And they stayed out there, although most of them had jobs. Many had jobs outside the dunes and just earned money and, came back to the dunes at night or for extended periods of time. But a lot of them did odd jobs around Oceano or Pismo Beach.
So they were still somewhat involved. It wasn't like a wall against the community.
Oh, no, not at all. They didn't separate themselves. There were a few that stayed out there trying to be hermits for years at a time, but even they connected with the outside world through intermediaries. They would have friends go to the market and buy groceries and take them to them.
What kind of things did they publish in their magazine, the Dunite Forum?
The Dune Forum was kind of a West Coast version of the New Yorker. It was a collection of political articles, editorials, poetry, prose, reviews, correspondence, and some of the intellectia of the 1930s contributed. People like John Steinbeck and Ansel Adams and let's see, I'm trying to think of some of the other people, but Steinbeck, Ansel Adams, and many of the great names of the 1930s, contributed. Martha Graham. Trying to think of some of these people's names, who's Robinson Jeffers, a lot of creative people out of the Carmel area.
So the Dunites were relatively well known then.
They were well known within like intellectual circles. People who were creative and had published and lived on the West Coast knew of them. And they couldn't be paid for their articles, but they were given, a free weekend at the dunes.
Was there, from what you know, is there kind of a message or a unified statement that they were going for? Or?
The unified statement was unity within community, the goals of, the commune that they lived at, Moimel, which is Celtic for pastures of heaven. It was named by a Celtic authoress of, she kind of like reprinted Irish fables and legends and fairy tales. Her name was Ella Young, and Moimel means pastures of honey in the Gaelic language. And
Honey or heaven? Pastures of.
pastures of honey.
Okay.
And it was supposed to be the heaven that poets go to when they pass. And I think they wanted to, most of them wanted to, wanted to advocate for like a socialistic lifestyle, not a communistic lifestyle or a democratic lifestyle or a fascist lifestyle, but an alternative, one where money didn't mean much, but ideas meant an awful lot, and where there was like a social credit that was, where people would get a living wage, just for existing, and people would contribute back as they, as per their talents.
That's interesting. So they're trying to be self-functioning, self-sustainable.
Self-functioning, self-sustaining, and then, kind of putting all their monies into like a communal pot, and sharing.
How have you, in your research, how have you found that did that work? Did they find success with that?
It worked. Unfortunately, the magazine only lasted about half a year, and that was because it was a fledgling magazine. They didn't have that many resources to put towards it, and it was the Depression, and they were charging $3 a year for a subscription, and people would rather put food on the table and eat than spend money on a magazine subscription, which was considered frivolous. And, Gavin's parents were very wealthy, but they would only, contribute so much towards that effort because they were getting older, and they didn't know whether it was going to last or not. And unfortunately, the magazine folded after about 6 months. It would have been amazing if, there was online communication would probably still be going, but that wasn't a reality back then.
And so the focus of your book, you said, is Gavin Arthur.
Yeah, it's a biography of him from his birth and beginnings in Colorado Springs, growing up as the son of a millionaire and a grandson of a president. To his journey, he went out to Ireland and fought for the Irish Republican Army, back in the early 20s when Ireland had become a country, but Northern Ireland was still part of Great Britain, and there was a movement to bring all of Ireland together as one nation. So he was a revolutionary. Then he came back after starring in a progressive experimental movie with his first wife, and then discovered the Oceano Dunes, and he lived there for about a decade, off and on. He married a second time, and they owned a home right on the border of Halcyon and Oceano. And then he sold that and spent the rest of his life in San Francisco as a well-known astrologer. And as a moving figure in the counterculture movement. He was friends with Alan Watts and with Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and co-created the Be In 1967 in San Francisco, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year.
Right, so it's definitely well connected.
Well connected, yeah. And his younger nephew married the daughter of Alan Watts, so there was a family connection as well.
Was there any tensions, or was there any things that went wrong? Why are the Dunites not around anymore?
I think the reason is that, we got more affluent in the 50s and 60s, and there was less of a need, to live by yourself and to live, a minimalistic existence. There was pressure, and then also there was the invention of the dune buggy, and the noise kind of ruined the solitude for a lot of people. A lot of the Dunites stayed after Moimel was abandoned and the Dune Forum, failed. But the last Dunite, I think, lived up until like 1974 in the dunes. And then he passed away, and then his cabin was burned down. But people still find, small relics here and there.
What have you taken away personally from learning the story, getting into the Dunites?
Just that we can live on much less than we think we can, that we don't need, consumer goods. We'd be better off growing our own food and bartering with our neighbors, and have a system where we, trade goods as opposed to cash.
So there's kind of sounds like you're saying proof of that there are alternative ways than what society presents for us.
There definitely are. And I think we would be better as a whole, if we were to do that. There wouldn't be as much sheepalism and consumerism, and you wouldn't have, Walmarts on every corner. And
Would you, could you see yourself living as a Dunite?
I would love to do that. If I lived back in the 30s or 40s, yes, easily. Today it would be a little harder, because it would be hard to get established and keep a low profile where you're under the radar as far as state parks go. In that particular area, or really any area.
What's the next step for your book?
Well, I need to finish it and then get it published. The History Society of San Luis Obispo, the ones that have the museum in SLO on Monterey Street, have approached me, and they're interested in publishing it. So, as long as they don't try to alter it too much, I would be very pleased with doing that. I'm friends with Eva, who's the curator, and she has a background from Halcyon, so it would be great to do that, and hopefully, within the next year or two, get that published.
Yeah, I would love to hear that story.
Oh, thank you.
We'll have to do a follow-up.
I'd like to do it because a lot of the people that I've met, people that were close to Gavin Arthur, are getting quite elderly now. I'd like to publish it before, they make their transitions.
Where can we go and listeners go to stay up to date on your project?
The History Center would be good. The Oceano Depot Museum would be another one. That's one that Norm Hammond, who's the author of the Dunites, who's been kind of like a mentor to me, he and Linda Austin, who is the curator of the Oceano Depot Museum and a good friend of mine as well. That's where they have their museum, which includes a whole room on the Dunites. I understand that the new Pismo Beach Nature Center off of Pier Avenue in Oceano also has exhibits on the Dunites. The South County Historical Society at the IOOF Hall has summer living history programs where they present little vignettes from history. I was involved in one of them. It was a satirical book about the dunes called The Face of the Clam. And I played the role of Luther Whiteman, who wrote the book.
We know they had the Dune Forum, their publication. Do you know if they had a lot of music or other art going on there in their community?
I know they had music, but it was more in the form of just getting a old record player and dancing to the songs of the era. They were able to get radio there. As far as artwork goes, everybody had their own art. There was a brilliant artist named Elwood Decker that lived in the dunes, and he painted a lot of oh impressionist, kind of like abstract paintings, but brilliant use of color, and he was quite an artist.
What's one final thing that you think people should know about the Dunites, or that they can take away from their story as it applies to SLO County or our area?
I think it's good to keep a progressive movement going, one which focuses on community. Think globally but act locally. I think people should rely more and more on farmers markets, community, small farms. Don't spend all your money at grocery stores and corporate stores.
The value of community, right?
The value of community, I think, is really
The value
paramount. It's that's what it was all about to Gavin.
Yeah, it's a good story. I think we all can benefit when we focus on our community.
Oh, I think it is. There's no way to lose, really, and you come out so much richer as an individual, and the community benefits just as well.
Well, I thank you for your time, John Reid, talking about your new book. What's the new book going to be called?
It's going to be called Gavin Arthur, Counterculture's Renaissance Man.
Gavin Arthur, Counterculture's Renaissance Man.
Yeah.
Telling the story of the local Dunite clan.
There's going to be a lot. The beginning is in Colorado Springs. We spend time in Ireland, but the big focus, and of course in San Francisco, where he ended his transition, where he ended his incarnation. But the most of it is going to be in the dunes. He lived here from like 1931 to 19, so it was, almost 20 years of his life. Some of the most productive years of his life were spent here.
That's definitely an epic story for sure.
I think it will be.
Yeah. Well, I'll be excited to check it out. Definitely keep us posted and let us know when you get the book out.
Will do, definitely. Thank you, JJ.
Thank you, John Reid, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
What you do makes a difference.